But God had a plan for this rooster. He said, I need you to do something for me. And the rooster did exactly what God wanted him to do. And God was able to accomplish great things with this little rooster. Well, I go into this story with children and tell them about that. But I'm going to present it a little different for us. If you want to hear my rooster story, go to Boyd School sometime during chapel. About every other year, I'll tell them that so the children will learn the story of the rooster. But I'm going to tell about Peter's denial. You see the little faces up there. I'm going to present this, and just in your mind, you can almost present this like like a great play. Those faces are masks that actors would wear, and you can think of Shakespeare's plays. The one that is smiling stands for the comedy, and the one that is sad-faced, that stands for the tragedy. And when you're thinking about a comedy, when I think of comedy, I'm sitting here thinking, well, I'm going to watch something that'll make me laugh. But that's not really what that means in classical plays. It just means this play is going to turn out good. You'll be happy at the end of this play. But the tragedy, now that's a play where the end is not good. And so that's the difference in a comedy and a tragedy. This story of Peter, we can end it two ways. I'm going to tell it as a tragedy in three parts. But then there's a fourth part of this where things turn out good. And if I have time, I'll tell that part too. And then at the end of these plays, they'll have what they call an epilogue. And that's where someone comes out and kind of explains the significance or some special point and kind of ties up the loose ends of the play. So I'm going to look at it and present it this way because we've got three different places where this story shows up in the story of Jesus. And we're going to start in Mark chapter 14 and verse 27. Now, I'll call this part one. Maybe I should have called this scene one. Scene one. You can almost imagine now the curtain's opening up. Scene one. And where are we? We're in the upper room. And that had not been a good Last Supper with the apostles. It's quite ominous. They're disturbed. He had already told them, one of you are going to betray me. And then he talks about the unleavened bread. This is my body, which is given for many for the remission of sin. And then the fruit of the vine. Drink this. This is my blood. In the kingdom, I want you to drink this in remembrance of me. Well, all of that's very disturbing and ominous. And now they've sung a hymn, and they're going to depart to the Mount of Olives where Jesus would go to pray. And it says, Jesus said unto them, all ye shall be offended because of me this night. Now that word offended means to stumble and fall. It's from a word where we get the word scandal. You might could read this. All you are going to be scandalized. But the significance of this word is you're going to fall into a trap. That's what Jesus is saying. You're going to fall into a snare, into a trap because of me this night. And then he said, it's written, I'll smite the shepherd of the sheep, and the sheep shall be scattered. This is what the prophets had said were going to happen. Jesus being the shepherd and his disciples being the sheep. We find it in Zechariah 13 and verse 7, almost the identical words that Jesus quoted where it was written. You right, remember, there are several prophecies of Christ in the book of Zechariah. One of them is prophesying his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. But then another one is talking about how the shepherd will be smitten. and the sheep will be scattered. And so he says, after I'm risen, I'll go before you into Galilee. He had told them repeatedly that he would be taken and would be crucified and he would rise from the dead. And so he's telling them again, but then he says he'll go before them into Galilee. If we get to part 4, that's where this story is going to end, in Galilee. Now, let's go to Peter said unto him, although all shall be offended, yet will not I. You know, Peter had a hard time learning this lesson, didn't he? You remember when Jesus said, whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And Peter said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he said, blessed art thou, Bar-Jonah. But then he began to tell them he would be taken to Jerusalem, betrayed and crucified. And Peter said, that won't happen. Put that away from him. Don't be thinking about that. And Jesus turned on Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. Well, Peter's got more confidence in himself than he ought to have. And here he is again, and he's saying, well, everybody else might be offended. They might fall in the trap, but that's not going to happen to me. And Jesus said this, verily I say unto thee, this day, even this night, before the cock crow twice, thou shalt deny me thrice. And the response from Peter, he spake more vehemently. When you think of that word, vehement, it's interesting. When I looked at that word, it says out of excess. That's what he's talking about. Out of excess. Where's the excess? Well, it's in Peter's heart. This is coming right out of Peter's heart. No, I won't. I will not do that. I will not deny thee. If I should die with thee, I will not deny thee in any wise. Peter says this vehemently. It's coming right out of his heart. And events are going to show that Peter meant this when he said that. And then you see how that Peter, being so bold and saying this, all the others said the same thing. They said, no, we will not do this. We will not do this. Scene 1. All right, let the curtains close. And you hear all the rumbling behind, and we'll open up at scene 2. And now the stage has changed. And we're just outside the Garden of Gethsemane. It's on the Mount of Olives. Gethsemane means an olive press. It's an enclosed space among those olives that were going on the Mount of Olives. I've been there. There's still olive trees growing on the Mount of Olives. In fact, you get the right guide, they'll say, now this was the tree where Jesus was praying. And of course, they don't know that. But those are ancient olive trees, and it's quite impressive. And over there, our guide took us to a special place where there was an enclosed garden still up there on that Mount of Olives that would at least represent what was going on here. Well, Jesus has been praying in that garden. He would go back to his disciples and they would be asleep. Well, he comes the third time. Now, this is in Mark chapter 14:41. He cometh the third time and said to them, sleep on now and take your rest. This time he didn't wake them up. The other 2 times he woke them up, said, couldn't you stay awake while I was praying? Now he said, just sleep on and take your rest. Now I put a musical rest in there. When you read through this passage, I think we skip the rest. Sleep on now and take your rest. Jesus is awake. His disciples are there sleeping. And there's a pause here. And in the silence, Jesus can see that mob come out of the gate of Jerusalem and coming down to that Kidron Valley. And now they're coming up that Mount of Olives. They're coming for him. And so after this pause, He says, it's enough. The hour has come. He's waking them up. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Lo, he that betrayeth me is at hand. You can imagine, have you ever been in a deep sleep and woke up suddenly, and how confusing all that is. And you're trying to kind of gather your senses and orient yourself. And so they're all waking up with this mob coming at them. And it says, immediately while he spake, cometh Judas, one of the 12, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves. I mean, they're coming. This is an armed mob coming after Jesus. Those staves, that's a stick where you can hit somebody with. That's what that is, the swords and staves. So you're waking up to this event, and Judas, he's kissing Christ. Well, Judas, that's one of us. What is going on here? And you can imagine the confusion. It says, they came from the chief priests and scribes and elders. He that betrayeth him had given them a token, saying, whomsoever I shall kiss, the same is he. Take him and lead him away safely. And as soon as he was come, he goeth straightway to him and said, Master, Master. And he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and took him. And then it says, one of them that stood by drew a sword and smote the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. One of those disciples. Against this great multitude with swords and staves, one of them grabbed a sword and went after him. John tells us, when he tells this story, that was Peter. He said, I'll die for you. And surely he did not think that he could stand against all that mob, but he was willing to fight to the death for his Lord at that point, and he even began to do it. Well, John goes on and tells us more things, and Luke does, about how he cut off his ear, and Jesus put the ear and told Peter, you put up your sword. But Jesus answered and said to them. Now, Mark just talks about how Jesus approaches those that had come for him. He said, are you come out against me as a thief with swords and with staves to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you took me not. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. Now, that was that scripture of Zacharias. Smite the shepherd of the sheep, and the sheep will be scattered. The scriptures will be fulfilled. And then it says they all forsook him and fled. That's all of them. All of those 11. Judas was the one that betrayed him, but those others 11 that says, no, we will not do this. And following Peter's leave, and now they all fled, just as Jesus said. This is interesting. There followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. And the young man laid hold on him. And he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. Well, what's the significance of this naked man? Now, none of the others tell about this. Only Mark tells this. And it's generally believed this may have been young Mark himself, that was not far away and ran out to see what was going on. And they grabbed that linen cloth. And so he just slips out of that and runs off into that cool night. And it was cool because they was having to warm themselves by the fire. Runs off into that cold night naked. Well, why is that told? Well, it may have been Mark. But whoever it was, it tells about how unruly this mob was and the confusion that was going on as it creates this disturbing scene amidst what's happening there in that Garden of Gethsemane and on that way to Jerusalem. Now we're going to part 3, scene 3. And we're in the courtyard of the high priest. I want you to imagine now that there's no roof up here, and you've got the front doors. That would be the entryway into the courtyard, and the high priest's house would be around the courtyard. And so there were several stories to this. And so you're down here out in the middle courtyard there. It's still outside. It said Peter followed him afar off. And then it says, even to the palace of the high priest, and he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire. See how Peter's getting himself in trouble? Following Christ, but not too close. And how many of us sometimes want to follow Christ, but not too close? We follow afar off. And before long, we're warming ourselves by the fire of those who have nothing to do with Christ. I want you to think of a pack of animals and the lion's watching after that animal and they're getting one off. He's wandered off. He's afar off. He's getting out there by himself. And that's the situation Peter is in. And so as Peter was beneath in the palace, that's what makes you think the palace was high, and he's down here in the courtyard. So there cometh one of the maids of the high priest. He's catching Peter unawares. Peter was willing to stand with one sword against that multitude with swords and staves, but now it's just a maid, a young girl. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked upon him. Now the words there mean she looked intently at him. She's studying him. John tells us that the fire was a fire of coals. It doesn't give off much light. I wonder if there was any moonlight. Or maybe some of the torches burning around the courtyard. But not seeing Peter clearly, she studies him and sees him, and she knows who he is. And so it says, she said, thou wast with Jesus of Nazareth. Notice, Jesus of Nazareth. You see, there'd been several from up in Galilee, that Galilee was a troubled place, and there are several that had tried to raise rebellion from Galilee. And so you were with Jesus of Nazareth. Now she's talking to Peter. And Peter denied, saying, I know not, neither understand what thou sayest. And then he went out to the porch, so he goes outside to the entryway, and the cock crew. That's one. I suppose Peter heard that. But somehow it didn't register what was taking place. And so the maid saw him again. May have been the same maid. May have been a different one. Again, John, if we go into John, it tells us that he'd gone back to the fire. He'd gone outside, and the cock crew. So he goes back to the fire. And now a maid saw him, and she didn't talk to Peter this time. She talked to those that were around him, saying, this is one of them. And he denied again. So that's twice. And then a little after, they that stood by. It's not the maid now, it's all these men. Some of them that had been up there where he'd drawn his sword. They that stood by said to Peter, surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech betrayeth thee, or thy speech agreeth thereto. We can tell by the way you talk. You know, you can tell sometime by the way people talk that they're not from here, can't you? So we can tell by the way you talk. And he began to curse and to swear, saying, I know not the man of whom you speak. You see how Peter got further and further and more bold in his denial? And the second time the cock crew. And Peter called to mind the word that Jesus said to him before the cock crowed twice, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he thought thereon he wept. Matthew tells us he went out and wept bitterly. Now there's the tragedy in 3 parts. However, there's a 4th part to this that Mark doesn't tell. You remember Mark 14:28, after I'm risen, I'll go before you into Galilee. Well, John, in John 21 and verse 17, tells about Jesus and Peter meeting at the Sea of Galilee. And 3 times Jesus said to Peter, lovest thou me? And Peter said, Lord, you know that I love thee. And he told him, well, then feed my sheep. And it's thought sometime that Jesus may have been redeeming Peter here. Because Peter had denied him 3 times. So Jesus now gave him opportunity to confess his love for him 3 times. Well, that would make it more the comedy than the tragedy at the end, wouldn't it? Because of Jesus. But now let's go to the epilogue. And this is what Peter says. Later, Peter would write, "Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour." You see what the devil did with Peter? He called him while he's following Jesus afar off. He called him while he's warming himself at the fire of those that did not believe in Jesus. He called him when he was alone, without the strength of the apostles around him. And he called him with a maid, called him unaware, slipped up on him, and Peter fell into the trap. I'm reminded of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where he says, "Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." And we know what happened to Peter. Peter went from that instant to becoming that great apostle, preaching on the day of Pentecost, standing fearlessly before persecution and on trial, declaring also the name of Christ. So he redeemed Peter. Jesus had said to Peter, "When thou art converted, strengthen the brethren." And that's what Peter did. And when Peter was not careful, he was falling. Boy, it tells us, don't we? We need to always be on guard. We need to be vigilant. We need to be watchful, lest we fall. Now, if we have fallen, we can be redeemed like Peter. We can come back to Christ and be forgiven and be useful to Him. So if you need to do that this morning, we extend that invitation as we stand and sing the invitation song.